How does a country with the fourth largest oil reserves in Africa end up with nearly half of its population living in poverty? When people think of a ruined nation, they usually think of Afghanistan, North Korea, or Myanmar. However, there are many others which many people have never even think about, and in some cases have never even heard of. Welcome to RuiNATION, a new series that I will be doing on this channel in which I cover the history, situation, and context of the world's most fragile, challenged nations. Our first stop on RuiNATION Station is Angola, the subject of this video. Hi, this is Olivia's History Zone. Here, I analyze geopolitics, history, and just anything else that I find interesting. As a reminder, I do make mistakes, so if I get something wrong, feel free to point it out. Just make sure to keep it respectful and evidence-based. Now, on with the video. Angola is a country located in southern Africa, as you can see on this map. It is bordered by the Atlantic Ocean to the west, the Democratic Republic of Congo to the north, the Republic of Congo, Zambia to the east, and Namibia to the south. Angola has a population of roughly 40 million people split up among multiple ethnicities, primarily the Ovimbundu, Ambundu, and Bakongo groups. The capital and largest city is Luanda, and the country is also a major exporter of oil. Remember that because it will come up again later in the video. Angola's early history is marked by early Bantu kingdoms such as the Congo, which was in existence from 1400 AD roughly to 1500 AD, when Angola was conquered and colonized by the Portuguese, which happened in 1482 with Portuguese explorer Diogo Cao. The arrival of the Portuguese marked the beginning of the slave trade, which boomed upon the formation of Luanda in 1575. From here, millions of Africans were sent to the New World, enduring horrific conditions and treatment. That is, for those who survived the often months-long journey across the Atlantic to Brazil, which is also a Portuguese colony. As a result, Angolan society was disrupted greatly. This is truly when Angola's destruction began. Under the Portuguese, Angola, like the majority of other colonial possessions in Africa, was shaped by exploitation, inequality, poverty, and strict colonial control. From 1884 to 1885, the Berlin Conference took place, which was held to divide Africa up among the European powers, particularly the UK, France, and Germany, but other countries were there too, such as Spain, Belgium, and Portugal, which used the conference to gain full control over Angola. It's important to note that throughout the entire Berlin Conference, not a single African was involved. With this, Angolan Africans were now forced into labor systems to grow cash crops like cotton and coffee. Land was taken from Africans and given to Portuguese settlers. A defining feature of Portuguese colonialism was the use of forced labor. Many Angolans were required to work under this kind of system known as chibalo, under which workers faced harsh conditions, little to no pay, and brutal punishments. Railways, roads, and other forms of infrastructure were only built to serve the colonial power, Portugal, not to benefit the locals, something common across European colonies in Africa. Society was deeply unequal too. While Portuguese settlers were at the top, a tiny group of assimilados, which were native Angolans who had learned and adopted Portuguese culture and customs, who had limited rights, and everybody else, the native Africans, who made up the vast majority of Angola's population. Those at the bottom were denied citizenship, education, and any sort of power. The purpose that Angola served for Portugal, indeed, the purpose that all the African colonies served, was the extraction of resources. In Angola's case, these were diamonds, coffee, agricultural goods, and later oil. Profits went to Portuguese companies and settlers, while the local population remained poor and, largely, uneducated, and rural areas remained underdeveloped. By the mid-20th century, many Angolans had had enough of Portuguese rule. They were tired of the chibalo system, land seizures, racial inequality, and the lack of opportunities. During this time, dozens of independence movements had spread across Africa, inspiring Angolan nationalists. In the 1950s, resistance began to form. The Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or MPLA, and the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, or the FNLA. All that needed to happen now was a spark to ignite the revolution, which came in 1961 with a series of uprisings. First, there was the Baixa de Cassange revolt in January of 1961, in which African workers protested abusive labor conditions. Portuguese soldiers responded with extreme violence, even allegedly bombing villages. Second, there were the prison attacks in Luanda in February of 1961, in which MPLA-linked militants attacked prisons and freed political prisoners. Finally, there was the Northern Uprising in March of 1961, in which the FNLA led a large uprising in northern Angola, killing thousands of Portuguese and African workers. Portugal, again, retaliated brutally, killing many Africans themselves. The aftermath of these events was the Angolan War of Independence. Nationalist groups shifted into guerrilla mode, and Portugal sent tens of thousands of troops. The war lasted roughly 14 years from 1961 to 1975. Now, you might think that once Portugal left, things would stabilize, but that's not what happened. The MPLA was ideologically Marxist-socialist and had its support base mostly in the urban areas of Angola, mixed-race elites, and the Mabundu ethnic groups. It was supported by the Soviet Union and Cuba. The MPLA was more intellectual and focused on Angolan solidarity ethnically. Its leader was Agostinho Neto, who became the first president of Angola upon independence in 1975 and remained in power until his death in 1979. There was the FNLA, which was led by Holden Roberto, who had a far less clear political stance than Neto. He was, nominally speaking, a nationalist. His base of support was in the north, with the Bakongo ethnic group. After independence in 1975, the FNLA quickly lost influence. Then there was the newest movement, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, or UNITA, founded in 1966, led by Jonas Savimbi, who had previously been a part of the FNLA. He had left as he thought the FNLA was too focused on the Bakongo ethnic group, and he wanted a movement more oriented towards the southern and central populations, particularly the Ovimbundu. Jonas Savimbi started as a Maoist, but later became fervently anti-communist, which would eventually draw the support of the United States and, interestingly, apartheid South Africa. UNITA would become the MPLA's main rival during the Civil War. All three of these groups from 1961 to 1975 had one goal: Angolan independence from Portugal. Their ideological, social, and ethnic differences didn't matter much. Yet. The Angolan War of Independence was, for the most part, fought using guerrilla tactics similar to the Vietnam War that was going on around the same time. Fighting took place in rural and border regions. Like in Vietnam, Portugal controlled the cities, but rebels controlled the majority of the rural areas. The Portuguese military was also fighting similar wars in Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau at this time in Point 2. Portugal was determined to hold onto its colonial possessions in Africa, shown in reintroduced propaganda like this, depicting its empire as vast and powerful to justify the wars. The title, Portugal now é país pequeno, translated means Portugal is not a small country. Another similarity to the Vietnam War was that Portugal committed major military resources and campaigns, just like the United States. It also helped Portugal that nationalist groups were becoming more divided along ethnic and ideological lines. And, like the Viet Cong and its support from the Soviet Union, outside resources from countries like the Soviet Union and the United States kept the war going. All of these factors contributed to the almost 14 years of war. The Angolan Independence War did not end because Portugal was directly defeated. It ended instead because of the Carnation Revolution of 1974, in which Portugal's dictatorship, known as the Estado Novo, collapsed. Portuguese were tired of sending their sons to die in what they saw as a meaningless, baseless conflict. The new government ended the war and all other colonial wars in Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique alongside it. Negotiations were entered, and on November 11, 1975, the War of Independence formally ended. But the War of Independence was followed by a brutal civil war, which pitted Jonas Savimbi's UNITA against the MPLA, which began before the ink of the treaty signed with Portugal was even dry. The next chapter of Angolan history was to be a dark one. The ideological and ethnic differences between the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA had finally come to a boil. Agostinho Neto was the president of Angola now, but things were far from over. All three groups turned on each other. Now that Portugal was gone, they disagreed on who should rule Angola, ideology, and ethnic regional power, meaning the beginning of the Angolan Civil War, which lasted from 1975 to 2002, making it one of the longest conflicts in African history. The FNLA faded early on in the war, leaving just the MPLA and UNITA to fight it out. The war became a proxy conflict for the global Cold War. Cuba and Soviet Union supported the MPLA, and the United States and apartheid South Africa supported UNITA. Cuba, in fact, sent some 300 to 400,000 troops between 1975 and 1991 to aid the MPLA. The war was fought with both guerrilla warfare and conventional tactics. Landmines were used frequently and readily, a legacy that still haunts the country to this day, for Angola is one of the most landmine-contaminated countries in the world, with some 9 to 15 million unexploded mines left over from the Civil War. Infrastructure was destroyed, with many schools and hospitals either being obliterated or abandoned. Life in the cities was no better. They were somewhat safer, but overcrowding was a major issue, exacerbating poor living conditions, unemployment, poverty, and the growth of slums. Civilians, of course, suffered the most. It was common for men to be forced into serving either UNITA in rural areas or the MPLA in more urban areas. Child soldiers were used by both the MPLA and UNITA, creating long-lasting generational trauma. People lost limbs from unknowingly walking onto landmines. Because of the same mines, farming was much more difficult, which was a big problem in a country as dependent on subsistence farming as Angola was. As a result, starvation and famine were commonplace throughout the war. Even with the bountiful diamonds and oil, most Angolans lived in poverty, with the GDP per capita declining roughly 40% between 1991 and 2002 alone. Finally, after some 27 years, some 500,000 to 1 million dead, and over 4 million displaced, the Civil War ended after Jonas Savimbi's death in 2002 and the subsequent peace treaty. UNITA transitioned into a political party and was dissolved. The MPLA had won. After the Civil War ended, millions of displaced Angolans returned home. The country had a long road ahead of rebuilding. Roads, bridges, and railways were destroyed. Millions of landmines still scattered the country, and agriculture had all but collapsed. But Angola experienced rapid economic growth in the 2000s, the result of massive oil reserves, of which Angola is a top producer in Africa. The boom made Luanda, Angola's capital, one of the most expensive cities in the world by the 2010s. Roads, housing, and other infrastructure were rebuilt or expanded. However, all was not well. Wealth was incredibly unequal, and corruption was rampant. This was largely attributed to the government of President José Eduardo dos Santos, who ruled Angola from 1979 to 2017, hoarding much of the oil wealth for himself, his family, and those in the government closest to him. There was the criticism that Angola functioned more like a competitive authoritarian state than a democracy, with the MPLA dominating all elections, in which opposition existed and could participate, but the odds were heavily stacked in favor of the MPLA. In 2017, João Lourenço became the third president of Angola, promising to tackle corruption, diversify the economy beyond oil, or at least attempt to, and take action against powerful elites. Change has been limited, but it is still a marked difference from the Dos Santos era. Socially, little has changed for the common Angolan. As of the making of this video in 2026, almost half of Angolans live below the international poverty line, between 36 to 42%. A little over half the Angolan population is thought to live on less than $3.65 a day. Angola boasts one of the worst healthcare systems in the world, with some 50% of Angolans unable to access adequate medical treatment. Public services are lacking, inconsistent, and understaffed, including healthcare. Angola consistently ranks in the top 30 for infant mortality rates. Based on 2026 expectations, it ranks 28th with 45.9 deaths per 1,000 live births and 60.7 deaths per live births for the under 5 mortality rate, placing it near the top 10 countries in the world. unemployment remains very high, with some models estimating 27% among the youth population are without a job. Angola's economy remains largely dependent on oil revenues, creating more volatility in the job market. Angola's story is complex. Colonialism played a major role in shaping its trajectory through exploitation, forced labor, and underdevelopment. But the decades of civil war and decisions made by political leaders also had devastating consequences. At the same time, those decisions, some of them at least, were influenced by Cold War dynamics, foreign intervention, and fragile institutions left behind by colonial rule. So the question I leave to you today is, who is truly responsible for Angola's situation today? Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful and or insightful, like, subscribe, and leave a comment on your thoughts below. If you disagree on anything, feel free to explain why in the comments. I'm always open to respectful discourse. Also, if you have a country suggestion for RuiNATION, let me know. I'll continue covering political and geopolitical issues with depth, context, and clarity.